The ancient stones of Westminster Abbey had witnessed 1,000 years of royal ceremonies, but tonight something felt different. As the first snowflakes of December began to fall against the towering Gothic windows, a small hand tugged at Prince William's coat. "Daddy, why do people cry when they sing the happy songs?" Princess Charlotte whispered, her innocent blue eyes reflecting the warm glow of hundreds of candles that flickered like stars throughout the sacred space. William knelt down to his daughter's level, his heart heavy with the weight of recent events that had shaken not just their family, but the entire nation. Behind them, Kate adjusted Prince Louis's collar while keeping a gentle hand on Prince George's shoulder, her emerald dress catching the light as she moved with the practiced grace of someone who had learned to carry both joy and sorrow in equal measure. The carol service was meant to be a celebration, a moment of peace and reflection during the Christmas season. But as the royal family took their seats in the front pew of the Abbey, where William's grandmother had been crowned, where his parents had married, and where they had said their final goodbye to Queen Elizabeth just months before, they couldn't have known that this evening would become a turning point that would test everything they believed about duty, family, and the true meaning of Christmas. What began as a simple family tradition would unfold into an extraordinary journey of discovery, challenging the young royals to see their world through entirely new eyes, and ultimately revealing truths that would change not only their own lives, but touch the hearts of millions around the world. The morning of December 15th dawned crisp and clear over Kensington Palace, with frost painting delicate patterns across the windows of apartment 1A. Catherine, the Princess of Wales, stood in her dressing room, carefully selecting her outfit for the evening's carol service. The emerald green dress she had chosen seemed perfect for the occasion, its rich color symbolizing hope and renewal during the Christmas season. William was already downstairs in the breakfast room with the children, and she could hear the familiar sounds of family morning chaos drifting up the stairs. Prince George's voice carried clearly as he explained something animatedly to his younger siblings, while Princess Charlotte's distinctive giggle punctuated the conversation. 3-year-old Prince Louis was apparently more interested in his breakfast than the discussion, judging by the clattering of cutlery against his plate. As Catherine made her way downstairs, she reflected on how much their lives had changed in recent months. The passing of Queen Elizabeth in September had shifted everything, bringing new responsibilities and a deeper understanding of their roles within the royal family. William had taken on additional duties as the heir apparent, and she had watched him navigate the delicate balance between honoring his grandmother's legacy while modernizing the monarchy for future generations. The children, too, had been affected by the changes, though they expressed it in their own unique ways. George, now 10 years old, had become more serious and thoughtful, asking probing questions about duty and service. Charlotte, 8, had developed a heightened sensitivity to the emotions of others, often noticing things that adults missed. And Louis, despite his young age, seemed to understand that something significant had shifted in their world, even if he couldn't articulate what it was. "Good morning, my loves," Catherine said as she entered the breakfast room, planting kisses on each child's head before settling into her chair beside William. "Mummy, tell George he's wrong about the carol service," Charlotte said immediately, her spoon poised dramatically over her porridge bowl. "I'm not wrong," George protested, his face flushing slightly. "I heard Papa and Granny talking about it. They said this year's service is going to be different because of all the people who need help." William exchanged a glance with Catherine. They had indeed discussed making this year's carol service more meaningful, focusing on those who were struggling during what was becoming an increasingly difficult winter for many families across Britain. The cost of living crisis had affected millions, and they felt strongly that the royal family should use their platform to highlight these issues. "George is right that we want to make the service special for people who might be having a hard time," Catherine explained gently. "But that doesn't mean it won't be beautiful and joyful too." Louis looked up from his bowl, his face serious despite the porridge smeared around his mouth. "Are we going to help sad people?" The question, asked with such innocent directness, made both parents pause. How do you explain to a 3-year-old that their privileged position comes with the responsibility to serve others, especially those less fortunate? We're going to show them that they're not alone, William said finally, lifting Lewis onto his lap. Sometimes just being together and singing beautiful songs can help people feel better. Charlotte nodded thoughtfully. Like when I feel sad and you sing to me? Exactly like that. Catherine smiled, reaching across to smooth her daughter's hair. After breakfast, the family settled into their usual morning routine. George disappeared to his room to finish homework, while Charlotte and Lewis played in the nursery under Maria's watchful eye. William retreated to his study for a conference call with his private secretary about upcoming engagements, leaving Catherine with a rare moment of quiet to review the evening's program. The carol service at Westminster Abbey had been her idea, born from a desire to create something meaningful during what would be their first Christmas without the Queen. She had worked closely with the Dean of Westminster and her own team to craft an evening that would celebrate hope, community, and service. The guest list included not just the usual dignitaries and celebrities, but also healthcare workers, teachers, volunteers, and families who had shown extraordinary resilience during challenging times. As she read through the order of service, Catherine felt a mix of excitement and nervousness. This event would be broadcast live, watched by millions around the world. Every detail mattered, from the musical selections to the readings to the way her own family conducted themselves throughout the evening. Her phone buzzed with a text from her private secretary. The advance team had arrived at Westminster Abbey, and everything was proceeding according to plan. The choir had completed their final rehearsal, the floral arrangements were being installed, and security sweeps were underway. In a few hours, one of London's most sacred spaces would be transformed into a beacon of Christmas joy and reflection. Around midday, William joined her in the morning room, where she was reviewing final details. He looked tired. She noticed the weight of his new responsibilities showing in the slight lines around his eyes. "Busy morning?" she asked, making space for him on the sofa. "The Foreign Office wants to discuss next month's overseas visit," he sighed, settling beside her. "And there's the matter of the duchy finances to review with the accountants." Catherine studied her husband's face. In the months since becoming Prince of Wales, William had thrown himself into his work with characteristic determination, but she could see the toll it was taking. The carefree young man she had fallen in love with at university was still there, but he was now carrying the full weight of his destiny. "Are you looking forward to tonight?" she asked softly. William was quiet for a moment, gazing out at the garden where a lone robin pecked at the frost-covered lawn. "Yes and no," he said finally. "I want it to be perfect to honor Granny's memory and show people that we understand what they're going through. But I also worry about getting it right, about saying the wrong thing or appearing out of touch." Catherine took his hand in hers. "We'll get through it together, just like we always do. And the children will keep us grounded. They have a way of cutting through all the protocol and reminding us what really matters." As if summoned by her words, Charlotte appeared in the doorway, having escaped from the nursery. She was carrying her favorite stuffed animal, a worn teddy bear named Mr. Snuggles, and her face bore the serious expression she wore when she had something important to say. "Daddy, I've been thinking about the sad people," she announced, climbing onto the sofa between her parents. "What about them, sweetheart?" William asked, wrapping an arm around his daughter. "Well, if they're sad because they don't have enough money for Christmas, maybe we could share some of our money with them?" The suggestion, delivered with such matter-of-fact logic, made both parents smile. Charlotte had inherited her mother's compassionate nature and her father's sense of duty, creating a combination that often surprised adults with its wisdom. "That's a very thoughtful idea," Catherine said carefully. "And actually, that's part of what we do through our charity work. We help raise money and awareness for people who need support." "But, I mean our own money," Charlotte persisted. "Like from my piggy bank. I have 12 pounds and 37 pence. William felt his throat tighten with emotion. Here was his 8-year-old daughter, living in a palace with every conceivable privilege, offering to give away her pocket money to help strangers. It was exactly the kind of instinctive generosity that his grandmother had embodied throughout her reign. "I think that's a beautiful gesture, Charlotte," he said. "Why don't we talk about the best way to help people when we get home tonight?" Satisfied with this response, Charlotte snuggled against her father's side, apparently content to let the adults handle the details of her charitable initiative. The afternoon passed quickly in a blur of preparations. Catherine had her hair and makeup done while reviewing final notes with her staff. William spent time with the children, helping George with a history project about medieval cathedrals that was coincidentally quite relevant to their evening venue. As the winter light began to fade outside, the palace became a hive of activity. Security teams conducted final checks, photographers received their briefings, and the cars that would transport the family to Westminster Abbey were brought around to the courtyard. Catherine took one last look in the mirror, adjusting the sapphire and diamond earrings that had belonged to Diana, Princess of Wales. Wearing them tonight felt like a way of including William's mother in this special evening, a reminder that the work they were doing built upon the foundation she had laid with her own charitable endeavors. The children were gathered in the entrance hall, looking remarkably angelic in their coordinated outfits. George wore a navy suit with a crisp white shirt and burgundy tie, while Charlotte was dressed in a burgundy velvet dress with black tights and patent shoes. Louis, in his matching navy suit, was busy examining his reflection in the polished marble floor. "Everyone ready?" William asked, straightening George's tie one final time. "Ready, Papa," George replied solemnly, his natural leadership already evident in the way he positioned himself beside his siblings. As they made their way to the waiting cars, Catherine felt the familiar mix of anticipation and responsibility that accompanied major royal engagements. Tonight was about more than just a beautiful church service. It was about using their platform to bring comfort and hope to others, about modeling the values of service and compassion that would define the next generation of the royal family. The drive through London's evening traffic gave them a chance to see the city preparing for Christmas. Shop windows glowed with warm light, street decorations twinkled overhead, and people hurried along sidewalks wrapped in winter coats and scarves. Despite the economic challenges facing many families, there was still magic in the air, still hope for joy and connection during the holiday season. As Westminster Abbey came into view, its Gothic spires silhouetted against the darkening sky, Catherine reached for William's hand. Whatever the evening might bring, they would face it together as a family, drawing strength from each other and from the knowledge that they were part of something much larger than themselves. The car slowed as they approached the Abbey's entrance, where crowds of well-wishers had gathered despite the cold. Camera flashes began to pop as soon as their vehicle was spotted, and Catherine could feel the children straightening in their seats, unconsciously preparing for the public attention that was such an inescapable part of their lives. "Remember," William said quietly to the children, "tonight is about celebrating hope and helping others. Everything else is just details." Charlotte nodded seriously while Louis waved at the crowds outside his window, his natural exuberance impossible to contain. George sat perfectly still, clearly aware of the gravity of the occasion, but not intimidated by it. As they stepped out of the car and into the crisp December air, Catherine felt a sense of anticipation that had nothing to do with the cameras or the protocol. Tonight, surrounded by the ancient stones of Westminster Abbey and the voices of a magnificent choir, they would create something beautiful together. And in doing so, they would honor not just the memory of those who had come before them, but the hopes and dreams of all those who would come after. The massive wooden doors of Westminster Abbey swung open to reveal a breathtaking sight that made even the well-traveled royal family pause in wonder. The ancient nave stretched before them, transformed into a cathedral of light and warmth that seemed to pulse with anticipation. Hundreds of candles flickered from every conceivable surface, their golden glow reflecting off the polished stone and creating dancing shadows that brought the carved saints and angels to life. The Abbey's soaring Gothic arches disappeared into darkness above, giving the impression of infinite space reaching toward heaven itself. Christmas trees flanked the altar, their branches heavy with white lights and simple silver ornaments that caught and scattered the candlelight like fallen stars. The famous Cosmody pavement, where monarchs had been crowned for centuries, was barely visible beneath a carpet of deep red that led toward the sanctuary. But it was the people who truly transformed the space. Nearly 2,000 guests filled the wooden chairs arranged in neat rows throughout the nave and transepts. Catherine had insisted on a diverse congregation that reflected modern Britain in all its complexity. Healthcare workers who had served tirelessly during the pandemic sat beside teachers who had found creative ways to educate children during lockdowns. Volunteers who delivered meals to elderly neighbors shared pews with military families whose loved ones served overseas. As the royal family made their way down the aisle, Catherine noticed the faces of the congregation. There was Mrs. Henderson, an 80-year-old woman who had started a community garden in South London that now fed dozens of families. Beside her sat Marcus, a teenage volunteer who organized football programs for refugee children. Near the front, she spotted Sarah and James, a young couple who had fostered 15 children over the past decade, many of them now successful adults with families of their own. Princess Charlotte walked between her parents, her eyes wide as she took in the magnificent scene. The 8-year-old had been to many formal events, but something about this evening felt different. Maybe it was the way the candlelight seemed to make everyone's faces glow with warmth, or perhaps it was the sense of anticipation that filled the air like an almost tangible presence. Prince George maintained his composure admirably, though Catherine could see him stealing glances at the intricate stone carvings that adorned the Abbey's walls. His love of history and architecture made Westminster Abbey particularly fascinating to him. He had spent hours studying photographs of royal coronations and weddings that had taken place in this very space, and now he was seeing it all firsthand. Little Prince Louis seemed less impressed by the historical significance and more enchanted by the immediate sensory experience. His head swiveled from side to side as he tried to take in everything at once. The warm air carried the scent of pine boughs and beeswax candles, while the subtle sound of whispered conversations created a gentle murmur that reminded him of waves lapping against a shore. William felt the familiar weight of history as they approached the front pews. This was where his grandparents had been married, where his grandmother had been crowned queen at the age of 25, where the family had gathered just months earlier to bid her farewell. The continuity of it all was both comforting and overwhelming. He was acutely aware that every step he took added another small chapter to a story that stretched back over 1,000 years. The Dean of Westminster, David Hoyle, greeted them warmly at the front of the Abbey. A tall man with kind eyes and a gentle manner, he had worked closely with Catherine to create a service that would be both traditional and relevant to contemporary life. His deep understanding of the Abbey's spiritual significance, combined with his pastoral concern for the congregation, had been invaluable in planning the evening's program. "Your Royal Highnesses," he said with a slight bow, "welcome to Westminster Abbey. Everything is ready, and I believe we have created something truly special tonight." As they settled into their seats in the front row, Catherine took a moment to observe the congregation behind them. The diversity was striking not just in terms of background and profession, but also in age and circumstance. She saw elderly couples holding hands, young families with children who seemed simultaneously excited and intimidated by the grandeur around them, and individuals who appeared to be attending alone, but were clearly welcomed by those around them. The Abbey's famous choir, dressed in traditional white surplices and red cassocks, had taken their places in the choir stalls. Catherine knew that many of the boy choristers were the same age as George, and she watched her son observe them with interest. The Westminster Abbey choir was one of the finest in the world, and their voices would provide the musical backbone for the evening service. But tonight's music would include more than just traditional church choir selections. Catherine had arranged for several special performances that would reflect the contemporary relevance of the Christmas message. A gospel choir from Birmingham would perform later in the service, and a group of young musicians from a London music therapy program would accompany one of the hymns. As the congregation settled into their seats, and the last few stragglers found their places, a sense of expectancy filled the abbey. The official program listed readings, musical selections, and prayers, but Catherine knew that the most meaningful moments often came unexpectedly in the spaces between the planned elements. The service began with the haunting sound of a single voice singing the opening phrase of Once in Royal David City. The tradition at Westminster Abbey called for a solo chorister to begin this beloved carol, his pure treble voice floating through the vast space without accompaniment. The sound seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere, as if the abbey itself were singing. Gradually, the rest of the choir joined in, their harmonious voices building layers of sound that seemed to lift the very stones of the ancient building. The congregation remained silent during the first verse, listening with rapt attention as the familiar melody filled the space with its message of hope and incarnation. Charlotte reached for her mother's hand as the music washed over them. She had sung this carol many times at school and church, but here in Westminster Abbey, surrounded by candlelight and the voices of angels, it sounded completely new. The words about a baby born in humble circumstances took on fresh meaning in this magnificent setting. When the congregation joined in for the second verse, their collective voice created something magnificent. Nearly 2,000 people singing together, their individual voices blending into a sound that was greater than the sum of its parts. Catherine felt tears prick her eyes as she listened to the powerful testimony of shared faith and hope rising toward the vaulted ceiling. William found himself thinking about his grandmother as they sang. Queen Elizabeth had attended countless carol services throughout her long reign, and he could almost feel her presence in this sacred space. She had understood better than anyone the power of ritual and tradition to bring people together, to create moments of unity that transcended differences of background and circumstance. The dean stepped forward to offer the opening prayer, his voice carrying clearly through the Abbey's excellent acoustics. He spoke of the privilege of gathering together in this season of celebration, of the importance of remembering those who were struggling, and of the light that shines in the darkness of uncertainty and fear. As he spoke, Lewis began to fidget slightly in his seat. 3 years old was young for such a formal event, and despite his generally good behavior, sitting still for an extended period was challenging. Charlotte noticed her little brother's restlessness and quietly reached into her small purse for a pack of mints, sharing them with him in a gesture that was both sweet and practical. The first reading came from Isaiah, delivered by Tom, a teacher from Manchester who had continued to provide education for vulnerable children throughout the pandemic. His voice was strong and clear as he read the familiar words about light shining in the darkness, about the people who walked in darkness seeing a great light. Catherine had chosen this reader carefully. Tom represented the thousands of educators who had gone above and beyond their job descriptions to support children and families during unprecedented challenges. His presence at the lectern was a reminder that heroes were not just found in history books, but were walking among us every day, often unrecognized and unacknowledged. The congregation listened intently as Tom read about the promise of peace, the hope of justice, and the vision of a world transformed by love. His words seemed to echo off the ancient stones and resonate in the hearts of those present, many of whom had experienced their own moments of darkness and were searching for light. Following the reading came a musical interlude performed by a string quartet composed of young musicians from various London conservatories. Their selection, a meditative arrangement of the holly and the ivy, provided a moment of quiet reflection that allowed the words of the reading to settle into the minds and hearts of the congregation. George listened to the intricate interplay of violin, viola, and cello with growing appreciation. He had been taking piano lessons for several years and was beginning to understand the complexity and skill required for such polished performance. The fact that the musicians were not much older than himself made their accomplishment even more impressive. The second reading was delivered by Maria, a nurse from Liverpool who had worked in intensive care throughout the most challenging periods of the pandemic. Her voice was softer than Tom's, but it carried an authority born of experience and compassion. She read from the Gospel of Luke, the familiar nativity story that had been told countless times, but somehow seemed fresh and relevant in her telling. As Maria read about Mary and Joseph searching for shelter, about the birth in a stable, about shepherds keeping watch over their flocks, Catherine thought about the contemporary parallels. How many families tonight were struggling to find adequate housing? How many parents were working multiple jobs just to provide for their children? How many people felt forgotten and overlooked by society? The beauty of the Christmas story, Catherine reflected, was its insistence that the divine could be found in the most humble circumstances. The Son of God was born not in a palace, but in a stable, not to royalty, but to a young woman of modest means. The first witnesses were not dignitaries, but shepherds, people at the margins of society who were invited to witness the most significant birth in human history. Charlotte listened to the familiar story with new attention, perhaps influenced by her earlier conversation about helping people who were sad. She began to understand that the baby Jesus had been poor, that his family had struggled to find a place to stay. The parallels to contemporary homelessness were not lost on her 8-year-old mind, though she might not have been able to articulate the connection fully. The congregation joined in singing, "O come, all ye faithful," their voices rising in joyful celebration. The familiar Latin refrain, "O come, let us adore him," seemed to take on new meaning as it echoed through the abbey. This was not just an invitation to worship, but a call to recognize the sacred in the ordinary, the divine in the human, the extraordinary in the everyday. As they sang, Catherine noticed an elderly man in one of the middle pews wiping tears from his eyes. Beside him, a young woman gently placed her hand on his shoulder in a gesture of comfort and solidarity. Small moments of human connection were happening throughout the abbey as strangers shared in the communal experience of music and worship. The gospel choir from Birmingham took their positions for their planned performance, and immediately the energy in the abbey shifted. Their arrangement of "Mary Had a Baby" brought a different cultural perspective to the familiar story, their rich harmonies and rhythmic energy adding joy and celebration to the evening's proceedings. Lewis perked up considerably during this performance, his small body swaying slightly to the rhythm. The combination of voices created a tapestry of sound that seemed to invite participation even from those who remained in their seats. Several members of the congregation began to clap softly along with the music, and Catherine noticed that many people were smiling broadly as they listened. The cultural diversity represented by the gospel choir was exactly what Catherine had hoped to achieve with this service. Christianity was not the property of any single tradition or ethnicity, and the various musical styles and cultural expressions only served to enrich the overall experience of worship and celebration. As the choir's final notes faded into the vastness of the abbey, the dean returned to the lectern for a brief reflection on the evening's theme of hope and service. His words were simple but profound, connecting the ancient story of Christmas to contemporary challenges and opportunities. He spoke about the light that cannot be extinguished by darkness, about the hope that persists even in difficult circumstances, about the call to serve others as the ultimate expression of faith. His message was neither preachy nor partisan, but rather an invitation to consider how each person might contribute to the healing and restoration of their communities. The collection that followed was not for the Abbey's own needs, but for a network of charities that supported families facing hardship during the Christmas season. As the collection plates were passed through the congregation, Catherine reflected on Charlotte's earlier offer to contribute her pocket money. The gesture might have been small in monetary terms, but it represented exactly the kind of generous spirit that could transform communities and change lives. As the collection plates made their way through the congregation, Catherine noticed something unexpected happening in the rows behind them. Instead of simply placing money in the plates, many people were also contributing small, handwritten notes. She caught glimpses of folded pieces of paper being added alongside coins and bills, and she found herself curious about what messages people felt compelled to share on this evening. The dean had mentioned during their planning meetings that the Abbey sometimes received personal prayer requests and messages of hope during special services, but the volume tonight seemed unusually high. Perhaps the combination of the season and the diverse congregation had created an atmosphere where people felt safe to share their deepest concerns and greatest hopes. Prince George observed the collection process with the analytical mind he had inherited from both parents. He noticed that people seemed to be giving generously, but more than that, he saw the care with which many of them handled the plates, the gentle way they ensured nothing spilled as they passed them along the rows. Even this simple act of sharing had become a moment of community cooperation. The musical interlude during the collection featured the young musicians from the music therapy program that Catherine had specifically requested. These teenagers, many of whom had overcome significant personal challenges, performed an arrangement of Silent Night that transformed the familiar lullaby into something transcendent and new. Their leader, a 17-year-old named David who had struggled with anxiety and depression before finding healing through music, played a guitar introduction that immediately captured the congregation's attention. His fingers moved with practiced confidence across the strings, creating a gentle melody that seemed to invite everyone present into a moment of shared peace. As his fellow musicians joined in with voices, violin, and soft percussion, the familiar German carol took on an almost mystical quality. The arrangement was simple but profound, stripping away unnecessary ornamentation to reveal the core message of the song. Silent night, holy night, all is calm, all is bright. Charlotte felt herself relaxing as the music washed over her. The evening had been wonderful, but also quite formal, and this gentler interlude provided a welcome respite from the grandeur and ceremony. She found herself thinking about her own bedroom at Kensington Palace, how her parents sometimes sang to her when she had trouble sleeping, how music had a way of making everything feel safer and more peaceful. Louis had grown increasingly drowsy as the evening progressed, and the soothing melody of Silent Night seemed to be having a hypnotic effect on the 3-year-old. Catherine gently lifted him on her lap, where he nestled against her shoulder, his small body relaxing completely as the music continued. William watched his youngest son surrender to sleep in his mother's arms, and he felt a profound sense of gratitude for these simple moments of family intimacy that could occur even in the midst of public duty. The image of Catherine cradling Louis while surrounded by the majesty of Westminster Abbey seemed to perfectly capture the balance they tried to maintain between their public roles and their private lives as parents. The young musicians concluded their performance to warm applause from the congregation, their faces glowing with pride and accomplishment. Catherine made a mental note to ensure that their music therapy program received additional support in the coming year. The power of music to heal and transform lives was evident in the confidence and joy these teenagers exhibited as they shared their gifts with the world. As the collection plates returned to the altar, the dean announced that the evening's donations had exceeded all expectations. But more importantly, he said the Abbey had received over 300 personal messages from members of the congregation, sharing stories of hope, requests for prayer, and commitments to serve others in their own communities. He read a few of these messages aloud, with permission from their authors. One came from a recently widowed woman who wrote about finding comfort in community during her first Christmas without her husband. Another was from a young father who had lost his job, but expressed gratitude for friends and neighbors who had supported his family through difficult times. A particularly moving message came from a teenage girl who wrote about her decision to volunteer at a local food bank after attending the service. She explained that hearing the Christmas story in Westminster Abbey had made her realize that she wanted to be part of bringing hope to others, just as the shepherds had shared the good news they received on that first Christmas night. The diversity of the messages reflected the diversity of the congregation itself. There were notes from elderly people grateful for volunteers who had helped them during lockdowns, from healthcare workers asking for strength to continue serving others, from teachers hoping to make a positive difference in their students' lives, and from young people committing to environmental stewardship as an expression of their faith. As the dean shared these messages, Catherine felt her eyes filling with tears. This was exactly what she had hoped the evening might accomplish. Not just a beautiful service, but a catalyst for real connections between people, an inspiration for concrete acts of service and compassion. The next reading was delivered by James, a social worker from Edinburgh who specialized in helping homeless youth find stable housing and employment. His choice of passage came from the Gospel of Matthew, the familiar word about caring for those who were hungry, thirsty, homeless, or imprisoned. James read with the authority of someone who had seen both the worst and best of human nature. His daily work brought him into contact with young people who had experienced trauma, addiction, and abandonment, but he had also witnessed incredible resilience and transformation. His voice carried conviction as he read about the connection between serving others and serving God. Truly, I tell you, whatever you did for one of the least of these brothers and sisters of mine, you did for me. James read, his words echoing through the ancient abbey. The passage seemed particularly relevant given the diverse congregation and the evening's focus on service and compassion. Charlotte, who had been following along in the printed program, looked up at her mother with a questioning expression. Catherine leaned down to whisper a brief explanation of the reading, helping her daughter understand the connection between helping others and expressing faith. The final musical selection before the concluding prayers featured the combined voices of the Westminster Abbey Choir and the Birmingham Gospel Choir. Their arrangement of Hark, the Herald Angels Sing, brought together different musical traditions in a celebration of unity and joy that seemed to lift the roof off the ancient building. The contrast between the traditional Anglican choral sound and the rich gospel harmonies created something entirely new, a fusion that honored both traditions while pointing toward possibilities for the future. The congregation joined in enthusiastically, their voices adding to the magnificent sound that filled every corner of the abbey. As they sang about peace on earth and mercy mild, about the newborn king and Prince of Peace, Catherine thought about the challenges facing the world in 2024. Economic uncertainty, political division, environmental concerns, and social inequality all seemed to press against the hope expressed in the ancient carol. Yet here in Westminster Abbey, surrounded by people committed to serving others, she felt a renewed sense of possibility. The service was drawing to a close, but the energy in the Abbey seemed to be building rather than diminishing. Something had been created during the past hour and a half that transcended the individual elements of readings, music, and prayers. A community had been formed among strangers. A sense of shared purpose had emerged from diverse backgrounds, and a commitment to action had grown from moments of reflection and worship. The dean offered the final prayers, including specific intercessions for those who were struggling during the holiday season, for world leaders making difficult decisions, for healthcare workers and teachers and all who served others, and for the children and young people who would inherit the world being shaped by today's choices. Prince George listened to these prayers with growing understanding of the complexity of the adult world. At 10 years old, he was beginning to comprehend that being born into privilege carried with it responsibilities to help others. The evening had shown him concrete examples of people using their talents and resources to make a positive difference in their communities. As the dean spoke about the light of Christmas shining in darkness, about hope persisting through difficulty, about love triumphing over fear, George found himself thinking about his own future. Someday he would be king, but before that, he would have many opportunities to serve others in smaller ways. The examples he had seen tonight suggested that real leadership began with paying attention to the needs of others and responding with generosity and compassion. The final carol was "O Holy Night," sung by a solo soprano whose voice seemed to float effortlessly through the vast space of the abbey. The congregation remained silent during her performance, listening with rapt attention to one of the most beautiful pieces of music ever written for the Christmas season. The soprano's voice rose and fell with the familiar melody, her interpretation bringing fresh meaning to words that had been sung for generations. "Fall on your knees. Oh, hear the angel voices," she sang, and many in the congregation found themselves deeply moved by the combination of musical beauty and spiritual message. As the final notes faded into silence, there was a moment of perfect stillness in the abbey. 2,000 people sat in complete quiet, absorbing the beauty they had just experienced and reflecting on the evening's messages of hope, service, and community. The dean offered a final blessing, his words simple but profound. "May the peace of Christ, which passes all understanding, keep your hearts and minds in the knowledge and love of God. Go in peace to love and serve the Lord." Thanks be to God. The congregation responded in unison, their collective voice strong and confident. As people began to gather their belongings and prepare to leave, Catherine noticed that many conversations were spontaneously starting among strangers. The shared experience of the evening had created bonds that extended beyond the formal conclusion of the service. People were exchanging contact information, making plans to volunteer together, and continuing discussions that had begun during the peace greeting earlier in the service. The royal family remained seated for a few additional minutes, as protocol required, watching as the congregation slowly filed out of the abbey. The candlelight continued to flicker throughout the vast space, and the Christmas trees still glowed with their white lights. But something had definitely shifted. The evening had accomplished its purpose of bringing people together in celebration and challenge. William felt a deep sense of satisfaction as he observed the positive energy in the abbey. This was exactly the kind of event that justified the monarchy's continued existence in the modern world. Not just ceremony for its own sake, but ceremony that served a larger purpose, that brought people together and inspired them to action. As they prepared to leave their seats and make their way back down the aisle, Catherine reflected on the messages that had been shared, the music they had heard, and the faces she had seen throughout the evening. The carol service had been beautiful and meaningful, but she suspected that its real impact would be measured in the days and weeks to come, in the actions that people took as a result of what they had experienced tonight. The royal family's departure from Westminster Abbey was deliberately understated, allowing the evening's focus to remain on the message of service rather than the grandeur of monarchy. As they made their way slowly down the aisle, Catherine and William took time to acknowledge individuals in the congregation who had participated in the service's readings and musical performances. Prince George walked with newfound confidence, his earlier nervousness replaced by genuine engagement with the people around him. When they paused to thank Tom, the teacher from Manchester who had delivered the first reading, George surprised everyone by asking thoughtful questions about his work with vulnerable children. "Do the children you teach ever feel scared about their families not having enough money?" George asked with the directness that only children possess. Tom smiled warmly at the young prince's question. "Sometimes they do feel worried," he replied honestly. "But that's why we try to create safe spaces at school where they can focus on learning and growing, knowing that adults care about them." Charlotte, overhearing this conversation, stepped closer to join the discussion. "Like how our Nanny Maria makes sure we feel safe even when Mummy and Daddy have to go to work." The parallel she drew between her own privileged circumstances and the experiences of less fortunate children demonstrated an emotional intelligence that impressed the adults around her. Despite the vast differences in material circumstances, she had identified the common human need for security and care. Lewis, still drowsy from his brief nap during the service, nevertheless managed to charm the young musicians from the music therapy program when the family stopped to thank them for their performance. His sleepy smile and small wave elicited delighted laughter from the teenagers, who seemed amazed that a member of the royal family, even a 3-year-old one, had taken time to acknowledge their contribution. David, the 17-year-old who had led the Silent Night performance, found himself in conversation with Prince William about the role of music in healing and community building. The young man's articulate explanation of how musical expression had helped him work through personal challenges clearly resonated with William, who had become increasingly interested in mental health advocacy. "Music gave me a way to say things I couldn't put into words," David explained. "When everything else felt chaotic, I could create something beautiful and ordered. It helped me believe that my life could have that kind of beauty too." William nodded thoughtfully. "That's a powerful testimony. Have you considered using your experience to help other young people who might be struggling with similar challenges?" David's face lit up with enthusiasm. "Actually, yes. I'm hoping to study music therapy at university and then come back to work with programs like this one. Tonight has made me even more determined to pursue that path." As they continued their progress through the Abbey, Catherine was struck by the number of meaningful conversations happening around them. The formal conclusion of the service had not ended the evening's impact. Instead, it seemed to have released the congregation into smaller, more intimate discussions about the themes they had explored together. She noticed Mrs. Henderson, the elderly woman who had created the community garden in South London, deep in conversation with Marcus, the teenager who organized football programs for refugee children. Despite the significant difference in their ages, they seemed to have found common ground in their shared commitment to serving their neighborhoods. Near the Abbey's entrance, the nurse from Liverpool who had read the gospel passage was exchanging contact information with several healthcare workers who had been in attendance. They were making plans to organize a support network for medical professionals dealing with the ongoing stresses of their demanding work. The gospel choir from Birmingham had gathered near one of the side chapels, their animated discussion suggesting that they were planning future collaborations with other musical groups they had met during the evening. The cultural exchange that had begun with their performance was clearly continuing beyond the formal program. As the royal family reached the Abbey's entrance, they were greeted by the Dean of Westminster, who expressed his gratitude for their participation and leadership in creating such a meaningful evening. "Your Royal Highnesses," he said, "this has been exactly what Westminster Abbey should represent at its best. A place where people from all walks of life can come together in celebration of our common humanity and our shared responsibilities to one another." Catherine smiled warmly at his words. "Thank you for helping us create something truly special. I think we've all been moved by what we've witnessed tonight." The children were beginning to show signs of fatigue after their long evening, but they maintained their composure admirably as they said their goodbyes and prepared to return to Kensington Palace. The drive back through London streets provided an opportunity for the family to decompress and reflect on what they had experienced. "What was your favorite part of the evening?" William asked the children as their car made its way through the city traffic. George considered the question seriously before responding. "I like hearing all the different kinds of music, but I think I like the reading about helping people the most. It made me think about what I could do to help." Charlotte nodded in agreement. "I want to use my pocket money to help the sad people like we talked about. And maybe I could learn to play music like those teenagers did." Lewis, who was fighting sleep despite his earlier nap, mumbled something about the pretty lights and nice singing before finally succumbing to exhaustion in his car seat. Catherine and William exchanged a meaningful glance over their children's heads. The evening had clearly made an impression on George and Charlotte, sparking conversations about service and compassion that would undoubtedly continue in the days ahead. "I think we should follow up on Charlotte's idea about contributing to charity," Catherine said quietly. "And perhaps we can explore some age-appropriate volunteer opportunities for George." William nodded. The youth music therapy program might be a good place to start. David mentioned that they always need volunteers to help with younger children. As they arrived back at Kensington Palace, the contrast between their public evening and their private family life became apparent. The grandeur of Westminster Abbey gave way to the comfortable domesticity of bedtime routines, bath time, and story reading. While Maria helped the children prepare for bed, Catherine and William retreated to their private sitting room to discuss the evening's events. Both felt energized despite the late hour, their minds still processing the conversations they had experienced and the connections they had witnessed. "I think we accomplished what we set out to do," William said, settling into his favorite chair with a cup of tea. The service felt authentic and meaningful, not just ceremonial. Catherine curled up on the sofa with her own tea, her emerald dress replaced by comfortable loungewear. The messages that people shared during the collection were incredible. Did you hear what the dean said about some of them turning into actual commitments to volunteer or support specific causes? They spent the next hour reviewing the evening's highlights and discussing potential follow-up activities. The carol service had been successful as a standalone event, but they were both interested in ways to build upon the momentum it had created. "I'd like to visit some of the organizations represented tonight," Catherine said. "Not for formal engagements, but for more informal meetings where we can learn about their work and see how we might support them more effectively." William agreed enthusiastically, and "I think we should consider making the carol service an annual tradition, perhaps rotating between different themes each year. Tonight's focus on service and community could be followed by themes like environmental stewardship, education, or global cooperation." Their conversation was interrupted by Charlotte, who appeared in the doorway wearing her favorite pajamas and carrying Mr. Snuggles, her beloved teddy bear. "Mummy, I can't sleep," she said, climbing onto the sofa beside Catherine. "I keep thinking about all the people at the church tonight." Catherine wrapped her arm around her daughter, sensing that something significant was on Charlotte's mind. "What specifically are you thinking about, sweetheart?" Charlotte snuggled against her mother's side, choosing her words carefully. "Some of those people looked really happy when they were singing, like they forgot about being sad. Do you think music really can make people feel better when they're worried about things?" The question reflected the 8-year-old's growing understanding of the complexities of human emotion and experience. She had clearly been observing the congregation more carefully than the adults had realized, picking up on subtle cues about people's emotional states. "I think music can definitely help people feel less alone with their worries," Catherine replied thoughtfully. "When we sing together, especially songs that remind us of hope and love, it can make us feel connected to something bigger than our individual problems." Charlotte considered this explanation seriously. "Like how I feel better when you sing to me when I'm scared of thunderstorms?" "Exactly like that," William said, joining the conversation. "Music has a way of speaking to our hearts in ways that regular words sometimes can't." Satisfied with these answers, Charlotte allowed herself to be carried back to her bedroom, where Catherine tucked her in with an extra story and a gentle lullaby that referenced some of the carols they had heard that evening. When Catherine returned to the sitting room, she found William standing at the window, looking out at the palace gardens where security lights illuminated the winter landscape. His expression was thoughtful, and she could tell that he was still processing the evening's experiences. "Penny for your thoughts?" she said, joining him at the window. William smiled at her use of the familiar phrase. "I was thinking about what Charlotte said about people looking happy when they forgot about being sad. It made me realize how rare those moments of pure joy can be, especially for people dealing with real hardship." Catherine nodded, understanding the direction of his thoughts. "It's a privilege to be able to create spaces where that kind of joy can happen, even temporarily. And a responsibility," William added. "Tonight showed me that we have more power to bring people together and inspire positive action than I sometimes remember. The challenge is figuring out how to use that power wisely and consistently." They stood together in comfortable silence, watching the play of light and shadow across the garden. The evening had been a success by any measure, but, more importantly, it had reminded them of their capacity to make a meaningful difference in people's lives. "I want to check on George before we go to bed," Catherine said finally. "I think tonight might have raised some questions for him about his future role." They made their way quietly to their eldest son's bedroom, where they found him still awake, reading by lamplight. At 10 years old, George was developing the habit of processing significant experiences through books and quiet reflection. "Trouble sleeping?" William asked gently, settling on the edge of his son's bed. George marked his place in the book and set it aside. I keep thinking about what that man James said about helping people who don't have homes. Is it something kings are supposed to do? The question revealed the depth of George's thinking about his future responsibilities. Unlike previous generations of royal children, he was growing up with a much more immediate awareness of his eventual role and the expectations that came with it. Kings and queens have many responsibilities, William replied carefully. Some are ceremonial, like tonight's carol service, but the most important ones involve using their position to help solve problems and bring people together around important issues. Catherine sat on the other side of the bed, adding her perspective. What matters most is that you develop a caring heart and the wisdom to use whatever power you have in service of others. The specific ways you do that will depend on the challenges facing the world when it's your turn to lead. George nodded thoughtfully, like how Great Granny always seemed to know what to say to help people feel better during difficult times. Exactly like that, William said, feeling a familiar tightness in his throat at the mention of his grandmother. She understood that leadership is really about service, about putting the needs of others before your own comfort or preferences. Reassured by this conversation and armed with a better understanding of his future calling, George finally felt ready for sleep. His parents tucked him in with the same care and attention they gave to their younger children, recognizing that even the future king needed the security of parental love and guidance. As they prepared for their own rest, Catherine and William reflected on the day's journey from morning preparations through the magnificent service to these intimate family conversations. The carol service at Westminster Abbey had been about much more than beautiful music and inspiring readings. It had been about the power of community, the importance of service, and the ways that individual actions could combine to create positive change in the world. Tomorrow would bring new challenges and opportunities, but tonight had provided a foundation of hope and purpose that would inform their choices in the days ahead. The ancient stones of Westminster Abbey had witnessed another chapter in the ongoing story of service and leadership, and the royal family had added their own voices to the chorus of those committed to making the world a more compassionate and just place. The weeks following the Westminster Abbey carol service revealed the true impact of that magical December evening. What had begun as a single event rippled outward through countless individual lives, creating waves of positive change that none of the organizers could have anticipated. Catherine received her first indication of the service's broader influence 3 days later, when her private secretary shared a folder thick with correspondence from members of the congregation. The letters, emails, and handwritten notes painted a picture of people whose lives had been genuinely touched by the experience of coming together in that sacred space. Mrs. Henderson, the elderly woman who had created the community garden in South London, wrote to describe how the evening had inspired her to expand her project. She had connected with several younger attendees who were eager to help transform additional vacant lots into productive growing spaces. The intergenerational partnerships that emerged were already yielding both vegetables and meaningful friendships. David, the 17-year-old musician who had led this silent night performance, sent a photo of himself at his university interview for the music therapy program. His application essay, he wrote, had been entirely inspired by the conversations he had experienced at the Abbey. The admissions committee had been so impressed by his articulate passion for using music to heal that they had offered him a place on the spot. Perhaps most moving was a letter from Sarah, a single mother who had attended with her 2 young children. She described feeling isolated and overwhelmed by financial pressures until the carol service reminded her that she was part of a larger community. She had connected with other parents from the congregation, and they had formed an informal support network that was already making a significant difference in all their lives. The professional follow-up was equally encouraging. Tom, the teacher from Manchester, reported that several educators who had attended were collaborating on new approaches to supporting vulnerable children. The gospel choir from Birmingham had been invited to perform at 3 additional events, spreading their message of joy and cultural unity to broader audiences. Most significantly, The Abbey had received requests from over 50 charitable organizations asking about future opportunities to participate in similar events. The model Catherine had created was clearly resonating with people who saw the value of bringing together diverse communities around shared values and common purposes. At Kensington Palace, the influence of the carol service continued to unfold through the daily life of the royal family. Charlotte had indeed contributed her pocket money to charity, but her gesture had sparked a much larger family conversation about money, privilege, and responsibility. During breakfast one morning, she announced that she had been thinking about the homeless people that James, the social worker, had mentioned in his reading. "Daddy, do we have enough rooms in our house for people who don't have anywhere to sleep?" she asked with the logical directness that characterized her approach to complex problems. William nearly choked on his coffee at the question. "Well, sweetheart, it's complicated. There are rules about who can live in royal residences and security considerations, but we have lots of empty bedrooms," Charlotte persisted. "And some of those people at the church looked really cold." Catherine intervened gently, recognizing an important teaching moment. "Charlotte's heart is in the right place, but there are other ways we can help people who need housing. Remember how we talked about supporting organizations that work on these problems?" This led to a family project that consumed several weekends. Together, they researched homelessness charities, visited shelters, and learned about the complex factors that contributed to housing insecurity. The children's questions forced William and Catherine to deepen their own understanding of issues they had previously approached more superficially. George, true to his analytical nature, became fascinated by the policy dimensions of homelessness. He read articles about affordable housing, mental health services, and employment training programs. His questions during family dinners often left his parents scrambling to provide adequate answers about economic policy and social services. "Why can't the government just build more houses for people who need them?" he asked one evening, his 10-year-old logic cutting straight through political complexity. "That's actually a very good question," William replied, launching into an explanation of budget constraints, planning permissions, and competing priorities that made George's eyes glaze over within minutes. The conversation did, however, inspire William to arrange meetings with several housing policy experts. If his 10-year-old son could identify the core issue so clearly, perhaps the adult solutions were unnecessarily complicated. Lewis, meanwhile, had his own interpretation of the carol service's message. He began insisting on sharing his toys with any child they encountered during public engagements. His innocent generosity delighted onlookers and created several endearing photo opportunities, but it also reflected a genuine understanding that sharing was an important value. During a visit to a children's hospital in January, Lewis spontaneously offered his favorite toy car to a young patient who had been admiring it. The gesture was entirely unprompted and resulted in both children playing happily together for the remainder of the visit. "He's learning that giving something away can create joy rather than loss," Catherine observed to William as they watched their youngest son teaching another child how to make the toy car's lights flash. The media coverage of the carol service had been overwhelmingly positive, but more importantly, it had sparked broader conversations about the role of faith and service in public life. Opinion pieces appeared in newspapers across the political spectrum, exploring themes of community, responsibility, and the ways that traditional institutions could address contemporary challenges. A particularly thoughtful article in The Guardian examined how the carol service had managed to be deeply Christian without being exclusionary, how it had celebrated faith while welcoming people of all backgrounds and beliefs. The author suggested that this inclusive approach might serve as a model for other religious and cultural events. Conservative commentators praised the service's emphasis on personal responsibility and voluntary service, while progressive voices highlighted its focus on addressing inequality and supporting marginalized communities. The fact that people across the political spectrum found value in the same event suggested that it had tapped into something fundamental about British values and aspirations. International coverage was equally positive, with several articles noting how the British royal family was adapting traditional ceremonial roles to address contemporary social issues. A feature in the Washington Post described the carol service as an example of soft power at its most effective, demonstrating how cultural and spiritual leadership could complement political and economic influence. The success of the carol service also influenced the royal family's approach to other engagements throughout the winter and spring. They began incorporating more opportunities for meaningful conversation and genuine connection into formal events, reducing the emphasis on ceremonial protocol in favor of authentic human interaction. During a visit to a school in Birmingham in February, Catherine spent extra time with students in the music program, remembering her conversations with the young musicians at the Abbey. She arranged for several of these children to attend a concert at the Royal Albert Hall, exposing them to professional performances that might inspire their own musical development. William's engagement with homelessness organizations deepened significantly after the carol service. He began making regular, often unannounced visits to shelters and support centers, spending time in genuine conversation with people experiencing housing insecurity rather than simply touring facilities. One particularly meaningful encounter occurred during a visit to a day center in Manchester. William met Robert, a former construction worker who had lost his job and subsequently his home after a workplace injury. Their conversation about the challenges of rebuilding life after setbacks led to a longer-term relationship in which William followed Robert's progress through a job training program. "Your Royal Highness," Robert said during one of their conversations, "that night at the Abbey showed me that people actually care about what happens to folks like me. It gave me hope when I didn't have much left." These personal connections were transforming William's understanding of his role and responsibilities. Rather than seeing royal duties as separate from real-world problems, he was learning to use his position as a bridge between different communities and perspectives. The children's schools also began incorporating themes from the carol service into their curricula. George's class undertook a project about community service, interviewing local volunteers and creating presentations about different ways to help others. Charlotte's Year Group organized a concert featuring music from different cultural traditions, inspired by the diversity they had experienced at Westminster Abbey. Even their religious education took on new dimensions, with discussions about faith and service becoming more practical and action-oriented. The children were learning that spiritual beliefs were meant to be lived out through concrete acts of compassion and justice. As spring arrived, Catherine began planning the following year's carol service, but with an important difference. Instead of organizing it entirely from Kensington Palace, she established an advisory committee that included representatives from many of the organizations and communities that had participated in the previous year's event. The first committee meeting, held in a community center in East London rather than at the palace, brought together an extraordinary group of people. Tom, a teacher, sat beside Mrs. Henderson, the gardener. David, the young musician, contributed ideas alongside James, the social worker. The planning process itself became an exercise in collaborative leadership and shared ownership. "This year's service should build on what we learned last year," Catherine said as she opened the meeting. "What worked well? What do we do differently? And how can we ensure that the impact extends beyond the single evening?" The suggestions that emerged were both practical and visionary. Several people proposed regional carol services that could involve local communities while maintaining connection to the Westminster Abbey event. Others suggested follow-up gatherings throughout the year to maintain the relationships and collaborations that had formed. Mrs. Henderson proposed a particularly creative idea, organizing the service around specific projects that could be launched that evening and supported throughout the following year. Instead of simply raising money for existing charities, the congregation could commit to new initiatives that they would develop together. "What if we announced 3 or 4 specific projects during the service," she suggested, "and then people could sign up to work on whichever one matched their interests and abilities? By the next year's service, we could report on what we'd accomplished together." The idea resonated immediately with the entire committee. It would transform the carol service from a single inspiring evening into an ongoing community of action and mutual support. As the meeting concluded, Catherine reflected on how much had changed since that December evening at Westminster Abbey. What had begun as an attempt to create a meaningful carol service had evolved into something much larger, a new model for royal engagement that emphasized genuine partnership rather than charitable patronage. Walking back to her car through the East London streets, Catherine noticed small signs of hope and community that she might have overlooked before the carol service. A mural celebrating local heroes, a community bulletin board advertising volunteer opportunities, children from different ethnic backgrounds playing together in a small park. The carol service had taught her to see these everyday examples of people caring for one another as the real foundation of a healthy society. Her role was not to solve problems from above, but to connect and amplify the good work that was already happening in communities across the country. When she arrived home at Kensington Palace, she found William in the garden with the children. They were planting a small vegetable patch, inspired by their visit to Mrs. Henderson's community garden project. George was carefully measuring distances between seedlings, Charlotte was decorating plant markers with colorful drawings, and Louis was enthusiastically digging holes with more enthusiasm than precision. "How did the meeting go?" William asked, brushing soil from his hands. "Wonderfully," Catherine replied, sitting on a nearby bench to watch her family work. "I think next year's service is going to be even more special than this year's." As the sun set over London, casting golden light across the palace gardens, Catherine felt a deep sense of satisfaction about the direction their lives were taking. The carol service at Westminster Abbey had marked the beginning of a new chapter in their royal service, one that prioritized authentic human connection over formal ceremony, collaborative action over charitable gestures. The ancient stones of Westminster Abbey had witnessed another transformation in the long evolution of British monarchy. But this change was not about constitutional structure or political power. It was about the simple but revolutionary idea that true leadership meant joining with others in the work of building a more compassionate world, one relationship and one act of service at a time. The story that had begun with a question from an 8-year-old princess about why people cry when they sing happy songs had become a testament to the power of bringing people together around shared hopes and common purposes. And as the royal family continued their work throughout the year, they carried with them the understanding that the most beautiful carol of all was the harmony created when diverse voices joined together in service to something greater than themselves.